All right, thank you all for joining May and the Magic Bullet. We're going into Jonestown, the aftermath. We did a few weeks on Jonestown, Jim Jones in particular, and then um, all kind of the Wikipedia version, and then into the depth that May Brussel provides in her work. And I just want to play a quick intro that she gives so we can get a flavor for her personality.
This is May Brussel following the ski report and the weather report. And this is Dialogue Conspiracy. We're going to talk about the news of the week. For those of you who are not familiar with the program, the format is to take the news of the week and show the articles or situations that pertain to the past political assassinations in the United States. It's my contention that we had a coup d'etat in Dallas in 1963 when John Kennedy was killed, and that the news is affected by that murder and all the other political assassinations that have followed since that time. Dialogue
And here's another little clip from May that I enjoyed.
warfare, and yet praises family for their nonviolence. The major media is so full of these contradictions and bullshit. You have to separate always from what they say they are from what they do. And
The major media is so full of contradictions and bullshit. You have to separate what they say from what they do. That sounds really familiar and relevant to all of our discussions on autonomy and certainly today's presentation and discussion. So let's get started. So we're starting with the idea that, and based on some of our evidence that we went over in the last couple of weeks, that Jonestown was an MK Ultra camp. And what evidence and information do we have to point in that direction? Well, this is kind of what they found after Jonestown. And then for those of you that are new, Jonestown was November 18th, 1978. Over 900 people were killed in Jonestown, Guyana. And they called it a suicide, but it looked more like a cult ritual. And some of the followers who didn't agree with the suicide were rounded up and either injected with cyanide or shot. And on scene at Jonestown, they discovered enough drugs to drug the entire population of Georgetown, which was the capital of Guyana, so 200,000 people, for more than a year. And these drugs were being used regularly to control the population of 1,100 people that they had at Jonestown. One footlocker contained 11,000 doses of thorazine, tranquilizer, and drugs used in testing for MK Ultra were also found in abundance. So sodium pentothal, chlorohydrate, demerol, thallium, and others. And Jones was actually addicted to a lot of these drugs himself, and he kind of styled this camp as a North Korean prisoner of war camp. And he ran this strategy of tension and trauma-based mind control against the cult members with around the clock loudspeakers, his drug-induced rants, and he compared this to the schedule that the North Koreans used of 8 hours a day of work followed by 8 hours of study. I imagine that communist China probably followed a similar work schedule. My understanding is that their current work schedule there is like 9 to 9, 6 days a week. That's what I've heard about that. And so he used this kind of, this author says cultural Marxist training, but and related to the work that's going on at Tavistock. And some of the things that characterize that are sensitivity training, attack training, so gathering a group of people and then assigning a leader, identifying the stronger willed people and kind of ostracizing them and shaming them or beating them into submission. And there is an actual death tape that they have that you could listen to on the San Diego State Jonestown website. And if anybody's interested, I can link you to that. I didn't have the stomach to listen to it. And Jonestown it had a first class medical clinic where they had to report every day to get their meds. And then Dr. Larry Schacht, who's a recovering meth addict and Jones's boyfriend, his role was to run the drugging program. Now, I haven't found any hard connection to him and Hjalmar Schacht of the Reich Bank, who ran the kind of the Nazi central bank and was around and about in America. I think he might have been from New York City and gone to college there, if I remember correctly, and came back after World War II, I think. But I haven't made the connection, but the name is the same. So that's interesting in itself. And so this guy, Dr. Larry, organized the cyanide Kool-Aid doses injections for the massacre. He had some hench nurses who administered the doses to children and forced injections, or resistors who were held down by the Red Brigade. And the Red Brigade was the enforcement arm that kept everybody in check. Now, I don't know about you, but these bodies look like they were placed. Like, it just doesn't seem plausible that they ended up in that configuration. It just doesn't seem right. Something about the pictures doesn't seem right. And initially they said that there were 200 victims, and then there were 600 victims, and then there were 800. So the body count kept going up. And that kind of points to some people potentially resisting or fleeing into the jungle. And in fact, when they went down to clean up and they held everyone off for 5 or 6 days, they found evidence that some people were shot, some people were injected in the back. And of course, the children that were down there, that was straight murder. So a lot of inconsistencies in the story about how the people actually died. But this author is saying that there's a lot of evidence that it was just exploitation. He used the drugs to control his pseudo slaves, and they were exploited by their social justice warriors on the Jonestown plantation. He didn't permit his members to leave, and passports were taken and mail was censored, and they were getting $65,000 in monthly checks from the government, welfare checks, and remember that he was so tied into the San Francisco community that he was in fact given like humanitarian awards, and they funneled people to him, like orphans or people who needed help. They would funnel them to the People's Temple in San Francisco, and there was an estimated $26 million deposited into foreign bank accounts. Oh, not only did they not improve Jonestown very much, but that money was in the handlers' names. It wasn't in Jim's names. So they actually, the defectors, the handlers, the people who survived, they went around the world and collected that money after the massacre. That's kind of where the money ended up. So there's a lot of like interesting characters around Jonestown. It's kind of endless who you can dig into, but there are some really like key characters to take a look at. But some of the survivors are the ones really to take a look at. These guys, Mike Prokes and Tim Carter, they were in the custody of the Guyana Defense Force after they tried to escape through the port. And Carter was said to be one of the assassins on the airstrip, and he was never charged, and both were later released. So there was only one person charged in Jonestown for the whole set of suicides, murders, and that was Larry Layton. And we talked about him last week and the Layton family and their influence, financing, and control. And there were at one point 6 members of the Layton family involved in Jonestown. And Lawrence Layton, the family patriarch, was the head of chemical warfare in the United States, just as a reminder that they were the ones funneling money in to this mind control experiment group. And so these people, some of the people who survived, like Charles Gary and Mark Lane, they were attorneys for Jim Jones, and they were incredibly connected to other events that were happening throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And it says that they were able to flee the scene, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense unless they were allowed to flee. There was they owned a couple ocean-going trawlers, boats that they had sent off, and they had used those for gun running and other things in the past. And Philip Blakey was one of the people who took one of the boats out to the Barbados, and there was another crew of people who were coincidentally at a basketball game in Guyana. So the basketball team and about 40 people were in Georgetown, and they had made a day trip out there. So they escaped, and I think one of those was one of Jones's sons was on that trip. And there's a lot of evidence that the suicides were rehearsed and they were community. And he called those white nights. And he would bring everybody in and rant at them for hours and sometimes days, and see who would drink the Kool-Aid and who wouldn't, who would resist. And then they would break down the resistors. And they may have thought that that night was another drill, another white night drill that went live. So getting into our interesting characters. So Tim Stone, he was an attorney for the People's Temple in San Francisco, and he ended up going to Guyana for some period of time. But I want to read this affidavit that he wrote. I, Timothy Oliver Stone, hereby acknowledge April 71. I entreated my beloved pastor, James W. Jones, to sire a child with my wife, Grace Stone, who had previously, at my insistence, reluctantly but graciously consented thereto. James W. Jones agreed to do so reluctantly after I explained that I very much wished to raise a child but was unable after extensive attempts to sire one myself. So my reason requesting James Jones to do this was that I wanted the child to be fathered, if not by me, by the most compassionate, honest, and courageous human being the world contains. So in fact, they did have a child, but that just gives you a mindset or a point of view as to what was going on. The attorney had his wife have a child with Jim Jones, and she later left him. And that became a bone of contention over time. The child that Jim had seen as his own, and there was a custody battle that went on. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So this is Grace Stone, mother of Jim Jones' son, John. So Tim Stone, he was known for his central role, and he eventually became a defector from the People's Temple, and his son John actually died on the airstrip, and they tried to get out. And this is a picture of Leo Ryan, and we'll talk about him a little bit more in detail. And he was killed on that day, November 18th, 1978. But Tim Stone worked as a deputy district attorney in Mendocino County, California, and he was assigned to the district attorney's Fort Bragg office. And he was quite connected, and he is the one who pressured Leo Ryan to go visit Jonestown to be assassinated, actually. And he's one of the several people that pressured Congressman Ryan to go down. But Congressman Ryan is saying that he went to Jonestown to retrieve Tim Stone's son. That's one of the reasons that he went down there. He had been a most vocal anti-CIA critic in Congress. And we'll talk again a little bit more about that. But Tim Stone, he was the top attorney and strategist and close friend and confidant of Jim Jones. And he appears to be kind of a agent provocateur. He had run spying missions in East Berlin in the early 60s under Alan Dulles and Richard Helms. And those guys were architects of the MK Ultra program, as you may not be familiar with that. But so there is strong evidence to support the theory that Stone was a CIA operative. At least the East Germans thought so. So he was operating in Germany. In the 60s, early 60s, he was arrested for charges of espionage by the East German police photographing military installations near the Berlin Wall. He was accused of being a CIA spy and held for 9 days before being deported. And then he lectured against communism and joined forces with Jim Jones. And about the same time that was happening in Germany, Jones was close to arrest in Brazil. The local newspaper reporter observing his role in the brewing military coup in Brazil accused him of working for the CIA. So they had similar life experiences that go back not just in the jungle and with the disputed son, but his career in the People's Temple. He did really well. Tim Stone did. Governor Jerry Brown actually appointed him to the California Advisory Council, the Legal Services Corporation that administered all the federal legal aid programs in California. So he controlled a lot of money. He was tied into the governor, tied into the People's Temple. And then the child custody suit that he had with Jim Jones and his estranged wife kind of gave him a way to exit the People's Temple before it imploded in a graceful fashion. And then he could kind of distance himself. And you see a pattern of people exiting like a year or 2 years or even months prior to the tragedy, and then distancing themselves from Jim Jones. And remember that the money was scattered about the world in the names of the people who had then defected, and they'd collect the money after the fact. And nobody was ever prosecuted for what happened except for Larry Layton. And if Tim Stone was working in East Berlin in the 60s, then he was undoubtedly working with Reinhard Gehlen's organization, which was the rebranded Nazi intelligence organization that managed the Soviet Union and the East. And after World War II, Reinhard Gehlen, who ran that program for Germany, he made a deal with Alan Dulles and the OSS, which became the CIA, to keep his agents in place in the Soviet Union and just rebrand them as the CIA. Not only that, then as the United States they actually brought Reinhard Gehlen to the United States for training, and he appeared in the uniform of a United States military officer. All of the scientists, or not all, but some of the scientists, including Werner von Braun, Walter Durenberger, who was connected to the Kennedy assassination, they came to work in the United States under the Operation Paperclip. And a lot of the scientists who had done these medical experiments in Germany in the concentration camps ended up in the United States, and they just spun it back up under the name of MK Ultra. Yeah, and the rats began to flee, and they set themselves up as innocent. Okay. So that's Tim Stone. And about to go into Leo Ryan. Do you all have any questions or comments so far? All right, we will keep going. So Leo Ryan was a congressman from San Francisco, and he has a very interesting story. We'll get into some of it, but what got him kind of in trouble was he was a very good investigator. and he sponsored legislation to oversee the CIA's domestic operations, which they claimed didn't exist. So he became kind of skeptical and curious when things kept happening in California that seemed to point to CIA involvement. And he proposed some legislation that the CIA fought to have that oversight become part of a congressional committee as opposed to the military. And as people learned what was happening in Watergate, which was happening at the same time, people were kind of shocked what E. Howard Hunt was doing in Watergate, and that's when he introduced this legislation. So the agency had really strong objections, but the Hughes-Ryan Amendment passed into law, and it earned Leo Ryan 2 distinctions, a seat on the International Relations CIA Oversight Committee, and a very prominent position on the CIA's list of enemies at that point in time. And if he wasn't already in trouble with the agency, he was kind of demanding or taunting them with information request or demanding information about all of their domestic operations, which they claimed didn't exist. That was their official position, but Ryan knew better, and eventually they had to come to Congress and give him some information. They admitted to Ryan that they were operating in California, but they just gave him token reports about the projects, and it was all justified as national security. So that sounds kind of familiar. And he kind of didn't probe any further than that. Maybe had a feel for how far he could push that angle. So one thing that Ryan was in possession of was something that Jim Jones kept, was called the H file. And it was a strange list of deaths that were caused or occurred at the People's Temple. And all of the people's last names began with H, and they occurred in alphabetical order. So if you just read through this: hung by the neck from the rafters of her garage, shot to death in argument with the temple guard, heart failure, multiple head lacerations suffered in a fall, disappeared, presumed dead, cause unknown, crushed by a train car at the Southern Pacific Railroad. Everything was vastly different. And it had the effect of being able to distance the People's Temple from these deaths. But Ryan suspected that Jim Jones had something to do with that. And Sammy Houston, the father of Bob Houston, was a friend of Leo Ryan's. And the Bob Houston's kids, so Sammy Houston's grandkids, were in the care of Jim Jones, who after Bob Houston had his unfortunate accident with the train car, Jones took the 2 children to Guyana. And so what Ryan is saying is he thinks that there's a logical sequence to the H file murders in the alphabetical order. And he connected them to Jim Jones, and he knew if Jones were to continue the progression, his next victims would be Judy and Patricia Houston, the 2 children that Sammy Houston was asking him to save or rescue from Jonestown, or to protect. And this author says that, just as Jim Jones had used Bob Houston's love of music to control him, so too he used Leo Ryan's love of mystery and investigative intrigue to control him. And though Ryan didn't realize it, he was exactly where Jones and the CIA wanted him, destined to die in Guyana. So Ryan, think a little bit about the people who were coming out of Guyana. They were defecting. The rats were leaving the sinking ship before it went down. Those were the controllers and the people who financed and set up Guyana and had access to some of the cash that they had stashed around the world. Now, they had gone to Leo Ryan's office and said, "Hey, help us. We have people down in Guyana that we want to get out." And he decided to go down there against the advice of his counsel and multiple other people. And he went down at that time and was killed on November 18th, 1978. So the day of the massacre and suicides, with 4 other people on the runway. And Larry Layton was accused of shooting 2 of the defectors, because Ryan had put defectors on the plane to take them back to Washington. And Larry Layton hit a 38 revolver on the airplane, went in, shot 2 of the defectors, and then a truck, they said a dump truck, pulled up with a bunch of people with machine guns, and they sprayed the group that was there, and Leo was killed. And his aides and family immediately thought that the CIA had him killed because he was so passionately anti-CIA and introduced the Hughes-Ryan Amendment to push for more controls and transparency. And then in 1980, his legislative assistant, Joe Holsinger, testified that the CIA had a covert operation in Guyana, and that Ryan's investigation into the operation would embarrass the CIA by linking Jones to some of their most volatile programs and operations. So he provided some evidence to that theory that he was whacked on purpose because of its conflict with the CIA and its investigations. And on that same day is when they ingested that mixture of potassium cyanide and tranquilizers in the fruit punch, either voluntarily by force. So that is when they took the Kool-Aid. So that's the message: don't drink the Kool-Aid. So Ryan went down, people asked to leave. He stayed overnight. Several people were killed. And he was actually assaulted the night before by a temple guard with a knife, and they took him. They managed to get away from that. Leo did, but this is the last picture of him, and he has, obviously he's shaken. He has blood splattered on him, but he seemed like he's unharmed. But then moments later, he'd be assassinated out at the airport. And at the same time that a lot of things were going on in 1978, this is a study that is worth reading: individual rights and the federal role in behavior modification, because they were doing MK Ultra. They were doing all these experiments during that time. This is a 600-page publication about the constitutional rights of people not to be experimented on and have their behavior modified in these experiments. And so here's a picture. I think it's press picture. And then there's the plane. Yeah, I'm sure one of these is the congressman. And there's a picture of Larry Layton. And Larry was, again, the only one to go on trial for conspiracy to kill Congressman Ryan, the only sitting congressman ever assassinated. And he went to his first trial, and I think it was like 1981. So several years later, so 3 years later, which was declared a mistrial. He didn't have another trial until 6 or 7 years later. So he was out for close to 10 years. And then they did finally convict him and sentence him to life in prison. And I don't know. I need to follow up on whether he's out or what his status is at this point. Okay, so our next Rogues Gallery character is Mark Lane. And May says, I'm very proud to say that I've hated his guts. So Mark Lane was one of the initial investigators on the Kennedy assassination. And I read his first book. He wrote one of the first books to come out, Rush to Judgment. And I thought it was excellent. And he asked all the right questions, but it seemed like over time he became a cover-up agent. And May routinely takes this guy to task because he is like stage managing the investigation of the Kennedy assassination. And she kind of has a feel for what's really going on. And she says that these guys, Mark Lane, Dick Gregory, and even Larry Flint, like they're Robert Groden, they're the power control group. So they're covering up the evidence, and there's layers and layers of control. And in 1975, Mark Lane moved to Washington, D.C. He started the Assassination Information Board that was going to look back into the assassinations, and there was a congressional committee that ran, and he had a witness who saw James Earl Ray, the who was sent up for killing Martin Luther King, that put him somewhere else, that put James Earl Ray somewhere else when the shots were fired. And he controlled that person and kept her off of the witness stand. He controlled numerous other witnesses like that in the same way. And May says that, they're protecting the Paynes, which the Paynes were Ruth and Michael Payne, who worked for Bell Helicopter and Walter Dernberger and hosted Lee Harvey Oswald and Marina Oswald at their house. And she says that they're connected back to the Galen organization. So that's an interesting thread to go look at and unpack, that these things are all kind of related. So Mark Lane and a couple other people, again, Dick Gregory, Groden, they got connected with Larry Flint, who was the publisher of Hustler magazine. He also kind of controlled a publishing empire. And they, in the 1978 January 8th Dallas Morning News, published an article, Help Solve JFK's Murder, $1 million reward, back when that was a lot more money than it is today. And so Larry Flint, he was very controversial figure, and he, got kind of interested in the assassination, and he was being kind of managed by Mark Lane and Dick Gregory, and they put this reward up. Larry thinks it's a CIA, FBI plot. He published a lot of copies of his tabloid on that, and bankrolled an investigation team to see what leads came in. And Mark Lane was the head of this investigation team. Well, it just so happens that so this was in January 8th, Elvis's birthday, 1978. Oh, in March, it just so happens he was shot near the Gwinnett County Courthouse and paralyzed from the waist down for the rest of his life. Well, what happened to all the evidence and the witnesses from this evidence gathering exercise that they went on? So many of the witnesses around the Kennedy assassination were killed themselves. And this says an independent panel of experts and judges, including Ralph David Abernathy, Mark Lane, Dick Gregory, Lillian Smith, and Robert Groden, will determine the appropriate recipient and recipients of the reward. The public has the right to know who is behind the assassinations. No more cover-ups, secret testimony behind closed doors. Well, they hoovered up all that evidence, and we never saw it again, but we did get a big list of people who had evidence or were witnesses that they could then go work. So how many of those people got depressed and killed themselves or had unfortunate accidents? We don't know. But a little more on Mark Lane. He was friends with, he represented Lee Harvey Oswald in his death, and he also represented Marguerite Oswald, who was Lee's mother. And he was buddies with Alan Dulles. Dulles' girlfriend, Mary Bancroft. We heard about her earlier as being connected to Ruth Payne, because Ruth Payne vacationed at, she's Ruth Forbes Payne, and she vacationed at the Forbes family estate in Nova Scotia or Martha's Vineyard or something like that. And Alan Dulles and Mary Bancroft were there because that was the girlfriend. She was connected. So these connections go everywhere. And he also, Lane represented Jim Jones, and he escaped somehow from Georgetown while everyone else was killed. And he was, yes, offering $1 million reward for anyone who could uncover the truth. He was tied to the three tragedies before they took place: the Larry Flint murder, or attempted assassination, the Jonestown, and um, the Kennedy assassination. And he was also represented the Wounded Knee Indians. So he had a cast of characters, and I'm inclined to believe May's theory that he was covering up just enough truth to keep people interested, but to keep the layers where they need to be of cover up. All right, we're getting to Dan White, another interesting character. So if May says if we don't investigate the assassination of JFK and expose it, all of our elections will be the result of the bullet and blackmail. How true is that? We see like these things ripple through time, and we can make connections all the way back through these events. This is one thing that I really attracted me to May's work, was that all of these things happened when I was a kid or when I was growing up. And she, I heard the news version, which is the accepted version of propaganda. And then when I started listening to her versions of what was happening and peeling apart the connections and the rich detail in her broadcast, I just had to dig in deeper. I felt like the mud had been cleared from my eyes on so many things. Well, Dan White, I'm not going to do him justice, but he was on the board of supervisors. And he was a fireman and in San Francisco. So he was on the board of supervisors with Dianne Feinstein, Harvey Milk, and then the mayor was George Moscone. And he resigned because he couldn't make enough money and he couldn't hold the fireman's job and the supervisor job. That was the excuse as to why he resigned. And he was in Vietnam. He was connected to the military, and I needed to dig back into his history a little bit more. But he went in, so somehow he got access to the city hall, and he shot, allegedly, and killed George Moscone and Harvey Milk. But he kind of has a Sirhan type aspect to him, where he doesn't remember doing anything. He can't describe what he did. And it was very kind of convenient set of assassinations because those guys were connected to the People's Temple, Moscone and Milk. So Moscone was the subject of an ongoing FBI investigation into contributions that he received from the Summa Corporation that was considered a political payoff. Now, Summa Corp was a joint venture between Howard Hughes and the CIA. May has hours and hours on the Summa Corp and Howard Hughes, which we can go into sometime later. They were investigating the illegal support of Moscone, and it could boil down to a question of the CIA's illegal support of Moscone. And the investigation was getting more news coverage, and it might have led the FBI to uncover another agent of the CIA who'd given illegal support to Moscone, namely Jim Jones. And their investigation into Moscone's association with the Summa Corp ended abruptly with his death. Very convenient. So some of the connections that Jim Jones had, we've gone into a little bit earlier, but as late as 1977, so remember, that's just about 2 years before the November 1978 events, he was given the Martin Luther King Jr. Humanitarian Award at the Glide Memorial Church in San Francisco because he had set himself up as a humanitarian, as a like a social justice warrior, taking care of people, and when in reality he was running an experiment. And here's Jim with Mayor George Moscone. In 1977, he was sworn in to serve on the San Francisco Housing Authority. So that's where he got his people for the slave camp. He provided housing. He provided, um, spiritual guidance, but brainwashing service basically, and drugs, and controlled his quote parishioners or worshipers or whatever temple members, whatever he ended up referring them to. And this is the fantastic book that much of this information came from. There's a PDF version, which I've linked here. The paper version is about $100. So we're working off the PDF. And the basic premise of the book, really, and of this chapter, is that Jones or his superiors in the CIA ordered the deaths of Mayor Moscone and Harvey Milk 9 days after Jones ordered the destruction of Jonestown. They had a close association with Jim Jones. They had the opportunity and the ability and motives than of the convicted assassin. The convicted assassin, Dan White, he was maybe trying to get his job back, but it was a very thin motive. And the author's saying, yeah, we can't necessarily prove this in court, but it deserves some close scrutiny. And here's Jim and Harvey Milk. And there's several movies about that out too. So I thought this piece was interesting, where he says in May 7th, so remember, in March, Larry Flint had been shot, and this is 2 months later. Jones and his wife and Tim Stone and temple aides go to Grenada to meet with the Prime Minister, Gary of Grenada, to deposit money in the banks in Grenada. And he negotiated to buy the Grenada Holiday Inn, the biggest hotel on the island. And then Gary, the Prime Minister of Grenada, traveled up to Jonestown, right? He traveled up to San Francisco to meet with officials in Washington, not to meet with officials in Washington, but with Jim Jones out in San Francisco. And he was photographed at the People's Temple with Jones, Mayor Moscone, and the Lieutenant Governor. And he introduced Gary to his congregation. He said that Gary was arrested 51 times for resisting the British colonialism, internationally respected and recognized for his achievements. And the author states that, hey, if Gary was arrested for resisting colonialism, it's pretty interesting that the British present him with a knighthood or an award from a knighthood from Queen Elizabeth. So that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but it kind of foreshadows the coming invasion of Grenada to protect the medical students, which were actually operators or agents of the U.S. government in Grenada. And I think that occurred within a couple of years. I'll have to find the dates on that. All right, so this is calling this Beyond the Grave. So just for a little more context, so when Leo Ryan was brought back, agents of the temple, I have to get her name, but at the funeral, the agents of the temple went up to Mayor Moscone and said, keep your mouth shut about the People's Temple, and gave him a kiss on the cheek. And this was one of Jones's agents who was used for sexual entrapment. And Mayor Moscone had been seen in her presence at the temple in the past, so she was very familiar. And this woman was able to sit in the pew with the congressman, and Jimmy Carter was at the funeral, and actually go on the congressional bus to the gravesite. So she was connected in a way to these people. And then not 5 days later, Mayor Moscone and Harvey Milk were assassinated in their office. So Jim Jones and Jonestown, they continue to have impacts on people's lives over time. So this is the Myrtle family, and they changed their name to Mills, and they wrote a book about Jonestown town, and this author believed it to be accurate within what they knew. They changed their name to Al and Jeannie Mills. And then about 6 months after they published that book, February 26, 1980, a unidentified gunman entered the Human Freedom Center in Berkeley where they were and executed Al, Jeannie, and their daughter Daphne. And they were both shot in the head and died, and the daughter died later of her wounds, or they had to disconnect her from life support. So they didn't make it 3 years. So here's another story. So Paula Adams, she was an agent for Jim Jones, and she was seducing the ambassador of Guyana, not to Guyana, Guyana to the United States. And they had a daughter, and he regularly slept with the aide Paula Adams, and Jim Jones was happy. That's one of his blackmail operations. She survived. She was in Georgetown, which is the capital, not in Jonestown, and she moved into Mann's house and remained there for the next 5 years. And then in October of 1983, Paul Adams, the ambassador, and their infant son were found dead at their house. Now, all three have been shot point blank in the house. And he's saying that the ambassador was probably aware that Jonestown was in operation. He was not aware of the medical part of it, but what the mainstream news says that, hey, the woman shot to death Monday night in the Bethesda apartment was former trusted aide of the People's Temple cult leader, the Reverend Jim Jones, and the man said police killed her, their son, and then himself was the Guyanese ambassador to the United States. So they're calling it a murder-suicide. It looks like an Arkansas case. So this author is saying that on a national level, Jim Jones was really close to the Oval Office. He was really connected. And we saw some of that in his earlier work in Cuba, in Brazil, in Guyana, that he worked in planning for the Bay of Pigs in the Eisenhower administration. And he was the number 2 man in Kennedy's British Guyana operation. So Guyana was a British colony. Philip Blakey was a British agent who was married to Deborah Layton for the purpose of cover for both of their participation in the project. He escaped on one of the boats to Barbados, and they boasted that Lyndon Johnson was a member of the Disciples of Christ, which was the denomination that Jim Jones was ordained in. And he worked for the reelection of Richard Nixon and counseled him on Supreme Court appointments. He advised Carter and Mondale on the U.S.-Cuba relations and provided 10% of their campaign volunteers in California. So there's pictures of Jones with Rosalind Carter and all kinds of very positive things being said about him by politicians and members of in San Francisco. And I just we could read a few of these things so you understand how connected he was. So this is Willie Brown, Kamala's mentor, saying, I have the great pleasure of knowing a leader with a tremendous character and integrity, Jim Jones, who is the founder of the large movement called the People's Temple. The members come from virtually every racial, religious, and socioeconomic background. Reverend Jones is regarded among government officials, civic and religious leaders, and particularly the Black community and working class people, with utter respect for what he's done to upgrade the quality of life in our area and bring greater health and well-being to thousands of poor, minority, and disadvantaged people. Reverend Jones' influence for progressive change among the citizenry has been extremely impressive. His ministry, in addition to wide-ranging programs that reach out to every type of human need, also put his own newspaper to well over 500,000 people in the area. So this is what they were saying to cover his work. And here's the mayor, who was later assassinated, saying, potentially by his agents, Your contributions to the spiritual health and well-being of our community have been truly inestimable. I am heartened by the fact that we can continue to expect such vigorous and creative leadership from the People's Temple in the future. By your tireless efforts on behalf of all San Franciscans, you have demonstrated that the unique powers of spiritual energy and civic commitment are virtually boundless, that our lives would be sadly diminished without your continuing contributions. And certainly our bank accounts would be diminished without Jim Jones's contributions. And here's Catherine Graham, the president of the Washington Post. I'm very touched that your church has been so dedicated to the issues of press freedom. Pretty interesting. All right. So this is our third discussion presentation on Jonestown. It does kind of go on forever, and there are many other interesting characters and avenues to investigate. I think we're probably going to call it a done deal after this, unless people have specific things that they want to go into. But just remember that these things ripple through time. This political circle that Jim Jones moved in included Jerry Brown, Dianne Feinstein, Barbara Boxer, Nancy Pelosi, and they wouldn't be where they are if Harvey Milk and George Moscone were still running the state, or if they hadn't been assassinated. So it was an assassination of convenience that elevated and escalated some of these people into power. And so it has a ripple effect that's still coming down through time. At this saying, Jim manipulated the public opinion. He manipulated from about his People's Temple, and the State Department and the CIA didn't begin their disinformation campaign until late in the story, when they neglected to warn Congressman Ryan of the danger he would face in Guyana, which, as we've seen, there was a motive for them not to warn him. And in the wake of the tragedy, Prime Minister Burnham's CIA-installed government in Guyana refused to allow the FBI investigators into Guyana. They let the CIA in, and they let the military personnel in who removed the bodies. They even let independent reporters and researchers, but they were shadowed by an agent in a buddy system intended to direct and deceive those who would relay the story to the world. Yet the FBI was denied entry to investigate. I think this is the most critical and telling piece of this story, which is that there would be no official investigation into the assassination of Congressman Ryan or the death of over 900 Americans in Jonestown. So no official investigation. And the only person to serve time was Larry Layton. And as a final note, Dan White also got his, he only served for like 5 or 6 years in jail for the killing of the mayor and the Harvey Milk, the county supervisor. And he set himself up in Ireland so he could escape and not be tracked down or disturbed. But he made a fatal mistake of coming back to check on his property in San Francisco. And then he got really depressed and got carbon monoxide poisoning in his garage. So eventually they got him in the end. But yeah, just as a capper, no investigation of the death of 900 Americans or the congressman ever took place. No official investigation. All right. Well, that kind of sums up the presentation. Do you all have any questions or comments or feedback? Okay, well, if you think of anything, I really appreciate you all being on the call, and I hope you enjoyed it. And if you think of anything that you want to research or any links that you need or would like to see, please reach out. And I'll probably do another one next week. And what we do is we pick out a Mae Brussel episode, send that out to people for questions and comments. And you all can get on this mural board too and help build it and make comments. And I can show you how to do that at some point in the future. We might do a session with that. The idea is that we participate in history together in the investigation, and it becomes interactive. That's the idea. All right. Well, thank you all for joining. We will see you next time.